Hello, I'm Jonathan Mast, and welcome to this edition of the Sedgwick Podcast. We have a great guest today to talk about modern methods of construction. Mike Beber is a chartered building surveyor with Sedgwick. And Mike, thanks for being with us. You want to just give a quick overview of your background and experience before we jump into this topic?
Yeah, hi, Jonathan. I'm a chartered building surveyor. I work with Sedgwick's in the major loss department, so we deal with all the major claims for large insurers and deal with everything from fires to floods. And historically, I've worked in public and private sector, and more recently with the modular developments in the London region.
And how long have you been doing this?
I guess you could say for the last 30 years, but I've been working in the modular world for about the last 10 years.
So when we say modular construction or modular methods of construction, for our listeners who are not familiar, and I would be one of those, tell us a little bit more about it. What are the main advantages and disadvantages when people take this on?
Okay, so I think we're familiar with what traditional building techniques are, where bricks and mortar and timber are taken to a building site, and the walls and foundations and the roofs are put together element by element. Over the last 100 years or so, we've been using this technique, and I think we're fairly familiar with that as a concept. It's worked very well. If it's well maintained, buildings can last for many, many years. The things have moved on a little bit in recent years, and modern methods of construction, or MMC, is a bit like the conveyor belt system you'd find in a car manufacturing plant, where a part of the building is assembled and then moved along a conveyor system, and then another part is put together and then moved along the conveyor system, so that you effectively come up with a rectangular box which someone can live in, and then you can put that on the back of a low-loader lorry, take that to site and assemble it within a building. So that's kind of a more modern way of assembling somewhere to live or work, depending on what the use of the building is. And to give you an idea, these sorts of modules can be formed in a variety of materials, but actually a common material now is a steel frame with a reinforced concrete base and ceiling, and all of the elements within that box, say kitchens, bathrooms, bedrooms, floor finishes, lighting, and are all assembled within the factory. So there's very little work that needs to be done on site. So it's got a lot of control of it inside the factory. So just to run through some of the advantages of MMC, we've just touched on them for a little bit, that the high quality control that you have during the manufacturing process, and the low amount of waste that you have during the production of the modules. One also advantage of MMC is generally unaffected by the weather. So on a normal building site, if it's you've got a frost or extreme weather pattern, work will stop. Whereas if you're in a climate-controlled factory, work can carry on and the program can be unaffected, and the modules can carry on being produced. Another advantage of MMC is the increased energy efficiency and ease of design change during the life of the module. So if there's a change in legislation, say for example the insulation needs to be denser or a different material needs to be used, that can be adapted quite quickly in a factory, whereas on site that's a harder thing to change. So overall, the advantages for MMC over traditional is the speed and efficiency that the buildings can be produced, which equals a saving in time and costs and minimises any delay in the program. There's also a great benefit in reducing the carbon footprint of every building, which is a drive that we are all in this industry trying to reduce, with producing modules in one factory and reducing the number of people travelling to one site backwards and forwards, with delivering of materials and also building that particular building. So there's a lot of clear advantages there. There are some disadvantages to MMC, and supply chain issues is probably one of the bigger issues, where there are supply chain issues, so materials that get held up at ports or that run low and they are critical on the production line, that can have an effect on production of the modules and can affect the program ultimately. Another disadvantage for MMC is the consumer perception of MMC. Historically, we've over the 50s and 60s, we saw prefabricated buildings in the UK were quite drafty, leaky, and I think we're familiar with the historical problems with prefabricated buildings. So that's more of a consumer perception that we need to overcome, because the modern modules are much better and produce a much higher standard than those in the past. And I suppose the only other real disadvantage of MMC is the high upfront investment for investors to set up the factory and the installation of the production line. There's quite a high level of risk and high investment setting that up before modules can be produced, and any income can be generated from the delivery of those modules.
To me, that's pretty fascinating. And we were talking a little bit earlier offline. Maybe a visual or analogy is you were saying this is almost similar to Legos when this all comes together, referencing the childhood toy.
Yeah, I guess you could look at it as Lego blocks. We're all familiar with Lego blocks, where they go together, and modular construction is not too dissimilar to that. It's simplified form, but if you take a rectangular Lego block and you place one on top of the other, that's very similar to how we would form a modular building, even high-rise. Some of the highest that are being produced at the moment go up to about 30 stories. So that's quite an achievement. It's got a central core, which is everything's tied to, so they're not waving around in the wind. But that's the general principle of how the modules are fabricated and then installed on site.
That's really cool. Well, what is the status of modern construction in the UK specifically? Where does that stand as far as production and numbers and other parts of the world even?
Yeah, well, essentially there's a shortage of demand on all of our buildings in the UK, from everything from hospitals, factories, to residential buildings. So to give you an example, the annual target for 2025 is around 300,000 homes. And last year, 2022, we only got up to 192,000 homes. So we're pretty way short of where we should be. Of those 192,000, about 15,000 were modular homes. And that's expected to rise annually up to about 20,000 homes by 2025. So there is a demand for this. If you compare that to Europe, they prefabricate about 428,000 homes in 2022. So as you can see, it's a much bigger industry in Europe. And also, if you compare it to places like Japan, they produce around 132,000 prefabrications a year. which represents about 15% of their new housing stock. So globally, the construction of new modular homes is expected to increase by about 8% over the next 5 years. So it's an industry that is getting bigger, it's becoming more popular, it's being adopted. And a lot of the past preconceptions and ideas about what MMC is all about are being lost, and it's being adopted globally. And it actually forms part of the UK government's target and plan to decarbonise the industry by 2050, and we're all encouraged to drive electric cars and to improve the air quality and this is just part of the overall plan to decarbonise not only the building industry but the way we transport people around the country as well.
Well, we've got the what it is, how it works. So now, getting to the heart of things with what you do, what risks should insurers and brokers be aware of when assessing developments built using MMC?
Well, it's a good question because MMC, whilst there are lots of advantages and it sounds fantastic, as with every new form of construction, there are, of course, risks, and brokers and insurers are used to assessing risk when they're looking at developments. If we take a high-rise block of residential flats, for example, and if you put that in a residential built-up area, it may not be that built up when you first construct the tower, for example. And after a while, more buildings pop up around it, and that may create a situation where if there is a claim, if there is a repair that needs to be done as part of an insurance claim, it may be difficult to gain access to that building and repair that element of the building. So give you an example. If you had a 20-storey residential block and there was a fire on the 17th storey, and the compartmentation within that particular unit has done its job, everyone was safe, but there is a requirement to completely repair and replace large sections of that, not only the cladding but also internally. Due to its design, there is an inherent risk there on the costs involved in dealing with that particular building. This is something that brokers and insurers need to review as part of their assessment of the development. There are other aspects of risk that they need to consider. Material specific risks are also something that they should consider when looking at developments. So, for example, a lot of developers will go to one particular kitchen manufacturer and say that we need 150 kitchens for this particular block that we're developing. And it may be a certain size and a certain dimension, and they may not be compatible with others. So as the life of the building goes on and certain claims come up for escape of water or fires or whatever, replacing those kitchens during that part of the claim, it may cause difficulty in replacing that item and matching up elements of that kitchen. So that's another, specific risk which is common with modular construction. Modular construction also has some inherent design risks built into it. Where we described the Lego blocks on top of each other earlier, those Lego blocks cause or create very small voids which are inaccessible, and in the event that there is fire water or escape of water, there are pockets where that can sit and they are inaccessible. So, deconstruction of those areas and those voids can be quite costly and can be quite difficult and require specialist skills and specialist professionals to deal with those elements of a claim. So Cedric, we're adapting to ensure that we're up to speed on these sorts of developments and advising brokers, insurers on specific risks with MMC and developments. So you can see that there are inherent risks within this particular construction.
Well, when we think about the broader use, can modular construction be used in buildings for other industries? What's the future look like as far as that goes?
Yeah, I really think that the future of MMCs is the way the building industry needs to be looking at not just residential, but lots of other areas. So healthcare, education, office buildings, even temporary buildings. They all need to meet the changing building regulations that we are committed to over the next 20, 30 years to meet the 2050 targets. But I think MMC is in a good position to do that in all of the industries because it's so adaptable and it's so flexible. It uses BIM technology, so it's all on a CAD system and can be very carefully adapted for each design, for each industry, and to develop those parts of the building to suit the industry requirements.
Well, as we reach the end of our discussion and close out, we're talking a little bit about the future of MMC. Probably the biggest question, or one of the biggest questions, is how should insurers be assessing proposals as they come in, and what do they need to know?
Yeah, it's a great question because MMC has an enormous potential and it is a growing sector. So we are going to be seeing a lot more of these buildings, and there are inevitably going to be insurance claims dealing with these sorts of buildings. So what brokers and insurers need to understand is the inherent design risks within these developments, and the strengths and weaknesses with the types of construction. We've talked about some of the advantages and disadvantages of building the modular buildings, but once they are in position and people are living in them and working in them, inevitably there are going to be times when there's going to be claims, there's going to be damage to those modules or damage to those aspects of the building that need to be repaired. So I think it's important that brokers and insurers understand the risks and evaluate what the potential costs are and how those may affect premiums on particular developments. And the earlier that they identify those in the process, the less pain it is later on when claims arise.
Well, Mike, I appreciate all this information, and it sounds, the future is certainly going to expand and grow. So there's going to be more and more knowledge, I'm sure that you'll bring, and we hope you'll come back again and be on the podcast as this segment grows and evolves. And if our listeners want to learn more, they can always visit Cedric.com and check out resources there. And, of course, Mike Beber, our expert, and different ways to reach you. So, Mike, thanks for being with us today. I appreciate it.
That's fine. Thank you for having me.
Well, until next time, listeners, have a great day.